Hey everybody, welcome back to Pish Posh Reselling. This is Shannon. And one of the shops that I run on Etsy as part of my reselling business is called Pish Posh Notions. And I've had that business on Etsy since 2010. And when I started that business, I started off just selling little sewing notions, little craft supplies, mostly buttons, just lots of like little things at lower prices. I slowly began to add sewing patterns into my inventory there. And so I would say probably from 2014 on, I was doing a little bit of sewing patterns mixed in with some of those other notions. Now I really started to take sewing patterns, selling sewing patterns a little bit more seriously around 2019. And then obviously then 2019, 2020, we hit the pandemic. People were home. They were looking for things to do. People were starting new crafts, or they were picking up old skills that they didn't have time for before. And sewing patterns really took off during those years. So the number that you saw in my thumbnail, I would say that was, well, I know it because I added it up. Those were my sales in that shop from 2014 on. And those first couple of years, like I said, they were not, not major concerns or anything. So the majority of that money was just made in a short period of time up until today. I didn't include what I've sold so far in 2023. And that number also does not include the patterns I've sold on eBay and Amazon. So as you can see, there is money to be made from selling sewing patterns. And we're going to talk about it today. So I just want to start with what are, the types, the brands of sewing patterns that you want to be on the lookout for. Today's video is mostly going to be talking about kind of the nitty-gritty of a sewing pattern, what's out there, how do you know if it's cut, how do you know if it's uncut, what should you really be looking for. I'm going to have another video coming out later that dives a little deeper into the values, some of the good values of sewing patterns. I wasn't sure which video to do first, but I think today we'll just kind of talk about what to look for in a general basis. And then next video, we'll talk about patterns that sell for hundreds of dollars. What are, let's narrow it down to what are good, patterns to look for. So in general, there's like 4 major sewing pattern brands, right? And some of this you may know, maybe some of you sew or whatever, but we're going to look at Simplicity. This is an older, like 70s Simplicity cover. Even older, they look like this with the script along the side. Simplicity. Let's see. I don't know if I had another one. Nope. So another brand, that's one of the major 4, Butterick. This again is an older one. This one's maternity, 70s for sure. Then McCall's. Nice little 80s look going on here with her little big collar and everything. So that's McCall's. And all these pattern companies are still making patterns today. And so the style of their covers are going to change depending on how old they are. Here's like a newer Butterick one. And then the big name Vogue. Okay, so you have these, Vogue comes in these smaller, the same size as the other brands, basically. Or they have what are called like large envelope. You can see the difference. Let me show you the difference. They're a lot bigger, okay? So some of those include, this one is a Paris original. And then this one is a Paris original as well. You can see the designer is right here on the bottom, Lanvin. It's usually, a bigger name, Nina Ricci. They have designers that are attached or who design the patterns for those pattern companies. Vogue, here's a Vogue American designer. It's Bill Blass. And then another Paris original. You can kind of see over the years the different, this is Givenchy. So over the years, you can see the styles have changed a little bit, but the Vogue ones really stand out with the large envelope. And I actually love finding those. Out of those four, I will say Vogue is my favorite and the most profitable. I would probably follow that by Simplicity. And then McCall's. Simplicity and McCall's kind of, I don't know. I would say Simplicity first, then McCall's, then Butterick. Butterick lately, I've just kind of decided as I've tried to narrow down my pattern buying is Butterick I will pass over unless it's something really special, or, you know, what the pattern is for is just something super trendy. Then I go ahead and get that. But anyway, we'll talk more about that later, about what I look for. Okay, I just wanted to mention a couple other brands. So you have those main four, and those are the main four that you're going to find. But there are some other brands that I find on a semi-regular basis. And, you know, I will pick up and sell them depending on what they are as well. So Quick Sew is another one. Here's a couple examples of that. I don't pick up all the Quick Sews. I usually like things like this, accessories, outdoor wear. I've done really well. I had a bunch of like bathing suits, and those did pretty well as well. Then, so Quick Sew is one. Patterns Pacifica is a Hawaiian brand, and there's a couple others that are Hawaiian. Victoria Jones, what's it called? Paloa Patterns or something like that. But basically, any Hawaiian pattern I've not had a hard time selling. So just kind of keep an eye out for that. Kind of in the same vein, we've got Folkwear. This one has been a little bit hard to sell. That's why I actually have one to show you. But it's a kids. Kids patterns are just kind of slow for me. And but Folkwear does do adult clothing too, and they do all different types of like ethnic and costume and cosplay and that kind of thing. And that's generally always a good thing to keep your eye out for. And there's definitely a following for the Folkwear patterns. This one's just kind of a tough sell, and maybe I've had it priced too high over the years. I don't know. Another one is Advance. This is a vintage company. I don't believe that they make it anymore, but it was kind of absorbed into maybe another company. I just have a little sticky note on that. I don't know why anymore, but Advance is, you'll see that in older patterns, and some of those can do pretty well. And then Stretch and Sew. You might see these fairly often at estate sales or yard sales or things like that. I don't pick up all the Stretch and Sew for sure. I'm pretty picky about this. I've done well with like dancewear, leotards, things like that. Again, this is a girls one. It's taken a little bit longer, but the women's size ones sell much better and faster. Okay, so that, and then you'll also see, I guess we'll talk about it. I'll just go ahead and mention it right now, but you'll also see what are called mail order patterns. And so back in the day, this is just fun. Back in the day, a woman would be reading the newspaper, looking at a magazine, and there would be an advertisement for a sewing pattern. So this enterprising person, who when they were storing their patterns, they went ahead, they cut the newspaper ad out and glued it to the front of their envelope. Otherwise, you have to open the envelope to find out what the pattern is inside. So they went ahead and organized it that way. So that's kind of fun, which helps me also as when I need to pull it in order to ship it. Anyway, so they could send in a coupon and order a pattern from the newspaper, and it would get sent to them in the mail. And it just kind of looks like this. The instructions are folded up. The design of what it is on there. Then they had stamped the size of that particular one. And then the pattern pieces were inside that. So that's kind of fun. Now, so those are other, different kinds of brands and different kinds of types of patterns that you might come across. So mail order patterns, bigger names are Mary and Martin and Adams. And then there's a plethora of just no name. It could be that, Mary and Martin or Ann Adams made those mail order patterns, but their names were not on them. So let's look at what a sewing pattern involves. Okay, if you're brand new to selling sewing patterns, there's just a few things you should double check when you are looking at them in order to decide whether you want to buy them to resell them. So first off, you've got the pattern envelope. Okay, so a little bit of wear on the pattern envelope is not a deal breaker, even, if it's ripped or whatever. You just have to disclose it in your listing. The older and the more rare a pattern is, the more damage will be forgiven, even in the pricing. And then obviously something in really, really good condition could get you a little bit more. So you have the pattern envelope. On the back, a lot of times there's a little description of what it is that they can make from it. There's all sorts of measurements. On the pattern envelope is the size. Okay, so in this particular, it's a newer, like 80s, 90s pattern, and it has multi-sizes in it. So it's got size 8, 10, and 12 in one pattern, whereas older patterns, each envelope was a certain size. So this pattern is a size 14, that's it. Okay, but then it also has body measurements on it. So as you know, vintage sizing is different than modern day sizing. So what I end up doing in my listings is I'll put the size 8, 10, 12, but then I'll also say that it's bust 31.5, 32.5, and 34, so that they know kind of what that size corresponds to. Okay, so you have the envelope, lots of good information on the envelope for your listing, and a lot of these also have a date. Okay, I said 80s, this is actually 1992. Okay, so the date is right on there. And we'll talk about later, if there is no date, what to do about that, okay? And how you can figure it out. Okay, so then you would have your envelope. You make sure there's pattern pieces in your envelope, and then also make sure that there's instructions in your envelope. So sometimes that can get missed, if you're excited. But I always just kind of peek, like I'm at a thrift store or whatever, and I'm looking at patterns possibly to pick up. And all patterns are open, okay? Except for, okay, Quick Sew. These were the only ones that would come. They were sealed, all right? So if they're sealed, that's awesome. It means they weren't used. If they're open, you are gonna have to check what's going on inside of there. But all patterns in general from the pattern store are open, okay? So you can go ahead, you look inside and just kind of check out the condition of it and see what it looks like, and make sure the instructions are in there, because yeah, not having instructions is not really a good start to selling that pattern. Now, one of the biggest questions I usually get from people about the pattern about selling patterns is like, how do you know? Like, they might see this big pile of patterns and they're like, well, how do you know if it's cut or uncut or anything like that? So that's a good question. This one that I've been showing you is uncut, okay? And you start to get a feel for it after a while, but when you look inside the envelope, it just looks super neat, right? There's no crazy pieces sticking out or anything like that. It's super neat. And then if you pull this out and you look at it, it's, the way it's folded, you can even see where the cut lines are, and nothing is cut on this. Now, I have been fooled in the past because there are some very neat sewists, seamstresses, sewers, whatever, in the past who would cut their pieces and then they'd fold them and iron them and make it look all pretty. And then I all of a sudden realized, oh, okay, this is a cut pattern. But people like that are generally very careful with their patterns, and those patterns end up being complete anyway. So that is what an uncut pattern, and you call that factory folded. Okay, so a lot of resellers will use FF in their title if there's not enough room, or they just say uncut. So uncut factory folded is like the best condition that the pattern can be in. You can still be uncut but not factory folded because the person who owned it had opened everything, and then they're really hard to fold back perfectly back to this condition, right? And so you could, you can put uncut but not factory folded if you want to, just to explain. And if it looks neat and factory folded like this, I do not touch it. I don't open it up. I don't check it or anything like that because it will never look the same afterwards. So that's an uncut factory folded pattern. Now here's a pattern I showed you a minute ago. And you look inside and it's got, all sorts of smaller loose pieces in here. Okay, if you pull it out, you can see, it's neatly folded and everything. We've got our instructions, which is good. And just be aware, sometimes people tuck the little pieces of the pattern like into the instructions. But the rest of this, right, there's all sorts of just little pieces that have been cut. Okay. Now, do you want to list a pattern where it's been cut? And I say that is totally up to you. I have listed patterns that are cut, but for me, it will depend on how sought after the pattern is to determine whether it's worth my time to do that. So at this point, when I'm sourcing, I'm usually only sourcing uncut patterns. And if I come across something like this and it's vintage and it's a big name and it's Vogue and it seems like it's totally worth it to double check and count the pieces, I will do that. Now, counting the pieces is actually not that difficult. It's just a little tedious. Okay, so some people love it. Some people just grab a stack of patterns and they'll sit and watch TV while they do it. But basically what you're going to do is you're going to look in your instructions, and everywhere on the instructions or somewhere on the instructions, or even sometimes on the back of the envelope, there will be a little diagram like this that shows you all the pattern pieces that should be included in that envelope. And this one even has underneath, it has a list of the pieces that should be included in that envelope. Okay, so you have not only a list, but you also have like a diagram of what shape the pattern pieces are. So what I'll do is maybe with like a little pencil, or I'll get a little notepad and I'll write down, okay, it's supposed to have, does it say how many on this one? It's got like 15 pieces. I might on a notepad write 1 through 15. And then as I go through, I take this piece and I go, I look, it says it's got a big old 7 on there and it says sleeve. And I go ahead and double check that. I double check. So there's a 7 that looks like a sleeve to me. And then I check my list and 7 says sleeve. Okay, so then I just check that one off. And I just go through each piece like that and check for numbers. There are instances where, like here's number 5. There are instances where people have kind of messed up their patterns. And pieces from, I've got like a squeak going on in my room. Interesting. What was I saying? It sounds like a cricket or something, and I don't know if it's like inside or outside. Okay. So anyway, you know, there are instances where patterns can be kind of mixed up, and there can be, you know, with other like pieces from one pattern made it into another envelope. So, you know, like on this one, the one I was showing you, 7, it also has the pattern name and number there. And so that's like a quick double check. If things don't seem like they're matching up, if you have too many pieces to match your, you know, to match what it says you're supposed to have, then maybe that's what happened. So you just have to kind of be careful. You know, you could just, sometimes people say, okay, this pattern is supposed to have 7 pieces, and they just count, okay, there's 7 pieces here, and they let it go at that. So that's up to you. You can do it like that too, but also just be aware that sometimes things get swapped in and out. All right. Then it also depends on your business model. I've also heard of sewing pattern resellers who basically sell their patterns. They worry more about volume and not necessarily high prices. So they might sell a lot of their patterns very cheaply for 99 cents, $2.99, $3.99, $4.99, and they don't bother counting the pieces, and they're just kind of churning the listings out. And if the person gets the pattern and there's a problem, they're like, okay, no problem, and they just refund them. So that's up to you how you want to do that. I tend to have a minimum. I prefer to only list a pattern if it's worth about $10. I do have some patterns in my shop that are less than that are like $7 or $8. Sometimes it's because I've already taken the pictures before I realized that it wasn't as valuable. Or maybe it's a pattern it's not super common, but it's not super valuable. It's just something kind of interesting to add to my shop. I just throw it in there, even though it might only be $8 or $7. But usually sourcing patterns is fairly inexpensive. And so it has a good return on investment, and you have the, you know, kind of the wiggle room there to price things maybe a little bit lower if you want to. But there are tons of resellers on eBay, sewing pattern resellers, who are more into volume, and they're not so concerned with, you know, just selling the ones that are worth more. So that's totally up to you and the type of business model that you have. Okay, so we talked about the types, the brands of patterns. We talked about what should make up a sewing pattern, what you should look for to be inside the envelope. We also talked about an uncut pattern versus a cut pattern. And then we talked about counting the pieces. So if you count the pieces and all the pieces are there, then you can put cut but complete in your title or in your listing. The other thing you need to be aware of, the example I just showed you, as I mentioned before, some of the newer patterns have multi-sizing. So this one is 6, 8, 10, and 12. So if the pattern is cut, you need to note in your listing what line it's cut to or where it's cut to. Okay, so if we look at the example of the sleeve again, you can see that the pattern has multiple lines, and each of those lines is a different size. So we can look, they're labeled, and right up here, up in the corner, it says 12. Up here, sorry. So the line that they cut on is the line for size 12, which is awesome because that's the largest size on the pattern. So basically, this pattern is just, they've done all the work for the largest size, for size 12. So if a person needed a size 8, it's still there, okay? They can just cut it down even more. What is tricky is once it's cut to like a size 8, that's it, right? It's only a size 8 pattern. or only as, you know, the lowest one was 6 on here. So say it's cut to the lowest, that's the only size pattern it is, unless the person knows how to grade up and all that kind of thing, or size up. So I wanted to mention that. Now, as far as talking about, oh, another thing I need to mention. Hold on. Another thing I need to mention is when you're dealing with vintage patterns, especially the older back you go. So the ones that we see currently, even in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the information about cutting and all that is printed on the pattern, and those are called printed patterns. Okay, that's kind of the standard. That's what most are. So you don't really need to mention it. When you do need to mention it is if the pattern is unprinted, which is not that one, but might be this one. Yes. Okay, so this is an older mail order pattern, but it was also true in some of the early, like Advance or Simplicity. They had pattern pieces that look like this. And basically they're already cut out. So these, you know, these are just going to be a one size pattern. They're already cut out. And they're just already in the shape that you need, right, for whatever the piece is. And the only way to identify them is this like perforated number. That's, you know, a 2 perforated right into the pattern piece. Okay, so when you're counting those pieces, when you're double checking that these types of patterns are complete, there are numbers on there. You just have to kind of find them. Okay. Okay. So we are going to talk now about the types of categories of patterns that there are and which ones you might want to start with or might want to look at as far as picking up to resell, especially if you're just getting started. Well, I am just having a day. I just had to stop the video and run and pick up my groceries, which the grocery pickup thing was running late today, and it was like an hour and a half later than I had originally scheduled in. Not their fault. They're totally understaffed. I felt bad for the poor woman who was doing it. But anyway, I came back in here and I'm like, let me finish up this video. And I recorded about 10 minutes of me talking, except I wasn't recording. All the gems you missed out on. All right, so I'll try to remember what I said. Okay, so talking about what we want to sell or what's worth selling in the sewing pattern category. It can be overwhelming. Say you go into a thrift store and you find their notions, crafts, whatever section, and you know, thrift stores I've been in sometimes have just like a shelf and it's just full of sewing patterns. And then, you know, maybe you're at an estate sale and they have boxes and boxes of patterns and you don't know which ones are good, which ones are not, which are going to be a big waste of time. So I get that. It can be hard, and you know, a lot of the stuff I've learned just by doing over the years. Some of my early pattern purchases were just boxes. I was at an estate sale and there was like 3 sewing pattern boxes full of vintage patterns, and the price was crazy low, like $4 a box or something like that. So I'm paying pennies, and that was my sewing pattern education, and I learned a lot from that. So sometimes it's just kind of, the price is low enough, you kind of learn by doing, right? So hopefully use some of the information I gave you in the beginning of the video. You can tell which are cut, which are uncut. And then I would say if you're going to pick like one brand to get started with, just a safe purchase for reselling is Vogue Patterns, the VOGUE, right? Vogue. So you know, even just the plain kind of bread and butter, 1990s, 2000s, Vogue, bread and butter, easy kind of sales. Obviously, the more patterns you have listed, the more patterns you're going to sell. The only Vogue patterns I would maybe stay away from is if something is dated like 2021, 2022, you know, something super current, that there's going to be tons of those available and listed on eBay. Those might be a tougher sell. But the further back you go, the harder these patterns are to find, right? And there's certain styles or certain just even basic things that women who sew or men who sew people who sew are looking for. So it's not, you know, it's really hard to give a very definitive, oh, just buy these types of patterns. And, you know, even in the bolos that I'll give you in the next video, they're just certain ones to kind of keep an eye out for. But there's tons and tons of patterns that are worth $10 and higher. Okay. Anyway, so I would say, yes, you're good with Vogue. If you're getting into like the larger envelope Vogue, the older you go, the Paris ones, the bigger the designer name, we're getting into $30, $40, $50 and higher, even over $100 for some of the older Vogue patterns. Okay, the smaller ones are a good $10 to $15 bread and butter. Okay, so if you wanted to just start getting your feet wet, if you come across some Vogue patterns, just go ahead, give it a try. Okay, Simplicity can also be pretty good. They're also a very big name, and they cover all sorts of different things. But let's talk about a few different categories as well. So like I would say I sell mostly vintage patterns, and I love vintage. And so I think that's what I'm drawn to. And the value is actually higher on the vintage patterns. Now you can go super far back. I have this New York pattern is most likely, I don't think it has a date on it, but it's most likely 20s or 30s. I have a couple little girl or doll, actually these are dolls. And this is an old mail order pattern. It came in this kind of glassine envelope, Marion Martin, that we talked about earlier. Here's another little old Advance one, and it's for, I think it's a girl. I don't know if it's a doll. Nope, it's a doll. It's a doll's layette. Okay. And then some older, also 1920s Butterick. Okay, kind of get an idea of what these older envelopes look like. And here's definitely this one's a 20s one. So very interesting. You can get, you know, that's appeals to the historian and a lot of people. There are serious collectors for things like this. Okay, so that's vintage, obviously, bordering on antique patterns actually. So, but then vintage, you know, it spans a whole, you know, it's popular the same way like certain decades or certain eras are popular. Okay, so what I'm saying is, like, right now maybe there's a TV show that's super popular that's set in the 70s, right? So then there might be or the 70s are kind of being redone again, and so, you know, 70s patterns are going to be sought after. Okay, so if you see something that's just kind of screams a certain era or a certain look, then I would go ahead and grab that pattern. Now, like the one I showed you earlier, this is very mid-century, very 1950s. This one doesn't have a date, but I'll talk about that in the next video, how to date some of the patterns. It's going to be in the next video, I'm pretty sure. So anyway, this 1950s looking pattern. Now, when Mad Men was a super popular TV show and look, and everybody was really into mid-century type things, mid-century patterns sold super, super well. They still do, but not as fast as they used to. So kind of keep an eye on trends that are, you know, or certain things that are popular. So the same thing, like the 90s are really popular right now, 90s and Y2K. And that's true in clothing in general. And so it's also true in the sewing pattern world as well. So believe it or not, you know, I see this. This is another maternity. You know, it's very dated looking, but it doesn't matter. There are people who want that and who want to sew it. I'm in some Facebook groups with people who buy and sell sewing patterns, or people who are looking for certain sewing patterns. Or sometimes it's just kind of a show and tell sewing pattern Facebook group, and you might show one and they're like, oh, I had that pattern back in the 90s and I made it over and over again. I would love to find that again. Okay, so people are actively looking for the patterns that they want, and that's where we come in. Okay, so vintage can be really good. Okay, so like I said, the further back, the more expensive. Even the further back, like those early ones I showed you, condition won't matter so much. There can even be pieces missing. As long as you spell it all out and explain it, the patterns are rare enough that somebody might still want it. Okay, so another category that I have fun with is, I don't have a ton of examples, I just have a couple, but that's costumes. Okay, I sell a lot of costume patterns. So like, for example, I have this one. I picked this one up recently and I really should get it listed. This, I believe, is a $50 pattern. Okay, so look at that. Just kind of looks super cheesy by McCall's, but it sells very well. And I have a size large, extra large, and it looks kind of messy, but it's still uncut. So it's just, I think this extra piece is just a little too high and it kind of got dog-eared in the envelope. Okay, so that one is factory folded. We're good to go on that one. So I believe that's a $50 pattern if my memory serves me well. So I thought I had another costume pattern I could show you, but anyway, and costume patterns, one thing I want to say about them, you do not have to wait till Halloween time or whenever to list your costume patterns. Costume patterns sell all year round. Okay, so there are cosplay. Another popular costume style pattern are like medieval style patterns, right? So I've sold a ton of these, like Renaissance, medieval, and they're for people who go to Renaissance fairs, people who do all sorts of historical reenactment. So historical type patterns, definitely very, very, very good sellers. Okay, sometimes there's, you know, there's, you probably should look each one up. Which is great is that most newer patterns have a barcode, right? So it's easy to do like a quick eBay comp if you want to double check. But for the most part, I've bought costume patterns and then maybe I get home and I'm like, okay, like the McCall's costumes are like so-so, then maybe I'll just lot them up and sell them in a lot, okay? But like Simplicity, historical costumes can be really good money, and those I would list individually. Another category that I like to focus on and that I do pretty well in is men's patterns. Okay, I don't know this particular one. I didn't look up comps on it, but it's a Western shirt. So those are generally fairly popular. But there are less men's patterns out there. And there is a fairly good market for menswear patterns. So when I find men's patterns, no matter the era or anything like that, I usually try to pick them up, especially if they're in really good condition. Again, I still kind of stick with the uncut unless it's super old, and then I might make a decision on whether I want to mess with that or not. But men's patterns sell very easily for me. And so it's another something to kind of keep an eye out for if you just want to narrow down what you're buying. Another category we can talk about is crafts. It's another category I've had good success with. Again, not every craft pattern is totally worth it, so please don't just buy all of them. You know, sometimes I get them super cheap, and so I will just throw them in my shop, you know, for 10 bucks or so. But there are a handful of crafts patterns that are worth pretty good money. Now, here's an example of one, and I'm not quite sure what to make of this, but I've sold this pattern before for at least $25, and I've sold it like 3 times for $25 or so, possibly even a little bit more. Now, I just checked comps because I bought it the other day. I was like, oh, sweet, and I just grabbed it. Now, when I look at eBay in the solds, there are a ton that have sold for less than $5, and there's only one in sold that sold for like $20 free shipping. And I was like, oh man, so that's a good example of a pattern that is popular for a while and then maybe loses its value. So that's always something to keep an eye out for. Now, when I went over to Etsy, there are only 3 listed right now, and they range in price from $17 up to $24 or somewhere in there, right? So kind of the more of the prices that I'm used to, but there's only 3 listed there. So mine is going to go on Etsy. That's where my patterns get listed these days. Etsy, you can sell vintage on there. So a lot of my patterns qualify just because they're older than 20 years old. But you can also sell supplies on Etsy. And so you can sell a 2020 sewing pattern because it fits under that category of supplies. So will put mine over there, and you know, I am not going to waste time putting it on eBay, and we'll see what happens. We'll see if people are paying more on Etsy, or if those 3, who knows how long they've been sitting. So I'll give that test that as a little experiment. Generally, I will say people do spend more. I get better prices on Etsy for my patterns than I ever did on eBay. So I'm just gonna put that out there. So yeah, so that's my very basic synopsis of sewing patterns. This was like sewing patterns 101. So I hope there was some helpful information in there for you if you're thinking about sewing patterns. You know, if you want to just dip your toes, I would start with Vogue patterns, maybe a few simplicity, look for popular trends, look for, if you know something is trending clothing wise, then look for its equivalent in a sewing pattern. Vintage, if you find old patterns, go for it. Men's is usually a pretty easy sell. Women's, like we said, trendy and everything. Otherwise, they're bread and butter. And then craft patterns can do pretty well as well. So what I'm going to do on the next video is I am going to share some of my best-selling patterns. I'm going to share some other patterns that I find the research. We'll just do kind of like a research video and see what types of patterns are selling at those high prices. And then if there's time in that video, if not, there'll be another video. We'll kind of talk about the nuts and bolts. Like, how do you ship? How do you list? What do you put in your listing? What's your title? How do you store them? All that kind of thing. As I'm talking, it sounds like it should be its own video, right? Okay, so that was my beginning thing about sewing patterns. I hope that helped you. It can be a very profitable niche to resell on eBay and Etsy, even Amazon. But we have talked about other profitable niches that are kind of common to find at thrift stores, and that's flatware and utensils. And I have a video about both of those. And I hope you guys have a great weekend. I'm headed out of town, or I am out of town when you see this, and I will see you next week.